Chapter 14. "The Eastern Shrine," whispered Victor in surprise. "That was really where everything started for me." "I never knew about it until it was too late," said Jennifer. "Of course Molly Patterson built it in secret, and Erica Lawrence used it to hide the key of origins after her husband died." "I know that Erica wasn't particularly close with you," said Victor. "But how close were you to Molly?" Jennifer rubbed her forehead as she thought. "I'm sorry, Victor," she said. "I thought my memories would have all returned once I came here, but there are still a lot of gaps." Victor reached out a hand and gently grabbed her hand. She smiled as she felt the comforting warmth of his touch. "It's okay," said Victor. Jennifer shook her head. "It's not okay," she said as she turned away from him. "There might not even be a mystery if I could remember." "Perhaps," said Victor. "Or perhaps it would be no different than what Samuel, Ethan, Chloe, Lincoln, and Savannah knew. Do not be so quick to claim fault." His words made her feel calm. She turned and looked at him. He smiled. "You're right," said Jennifer with a sigh. There was a pause before another thought came into her mind. She sat up straight as she spoke. "I wonder what happened to Lincoln and Savannah." "I don't know," said Victor. "I wonder what happened to Lizard, Lucas, and Row 82. There was another pause. The sound of crickets chirping echoed across the prairie. The stars shined brightly in the night sky, and the crescent moon shined on their faces. They looked up into the sky as they sat together. The gust of cool air rushed by and made Jennifer shiver. She scooted closer to Victor, and the log on which they were sitting moved slightly. Victor pulled his arm around her to keep her warmer. "Would you like my coat?" asked Victor. "No," said Jennifer. "Then you will be cold." "Nonsense," said Victor. "I'm fine after that meal." Jennifer smiled as Victor pulled his coat off and put it around her shoulders. She pulled her long golden hair out from underneath the coat and pulled the black fabric around her arms. There was a familiar smell about it that made her feel as though she were in Victor's arms. She pressed her head against his shoulder. "It was surprisingly delicious," said Jennifer. "That's right," said Victor. "You weren't there to enjoy Jonathan's cooking in the future." "I feel terrible about that," said Jennifer sadly. "Don't," said Victor. "As much as I missed you, I am glad you did not have to deal with my time." "But I missed Jonathan and Kirana's wedding," said Jennifer. "I'm not sure you would have liked it," said Victor. "I mean, Kirana has unique tastes." "Still, I'm sure it was beautiful," said Jennifer. "Well, Jonathan did cook some really good meat," said Victor. "We think that his cooking skill actually tipped the balance for Kirana." "Really?" laughed Jennifer. "She finally softened up after a good meal." Victor smiled. "We don't know for certain," he answered, "but it certainly didn't hurt him. Everyone liked him more when he cooked." Jennifer laughed softly as she looked over away from the fire toward the place she thought they had gone. Instead of seeing the awkward couple, she saw Chloe and Sig. They seemed to fit together more naturally. Certainly they had their differences. Sig came from a completely uncivilized time where propriety was defined by the lack of serious criminal activities rather than the observance of habits and customs here. While Jennifer did remember how much of a stickler Chloe had been for etiquette, it had been more of a tool to measure the efforts of people to be kind and considerate. Sig may not have known the proper method for addressing people, and he certainly had been a little rough lately, but one look at his wide smile was enough to realize that he had a kind heart. "What about them?" asked Jennifer. Victor turned around and saw Chloe and Sig sitting next to one another. The light of the fire made their shadows appear to dance. "Do you think that two people from different times could work?" Her voice had a coy tone that made Victor smile. He turned back to face her. "I don't know," he said with a smile. "She's so much older than he is." Jennifer shoved Victor playfully. "Jerk," she whispered. He laughed and put his arm around her. He gently pulled her close and smiled. Her desire to feign anger melted away as she watched the light of the fire reflect in his eyes, and she leaned slightly closer to him and smiled. Their smiles faded, and they moved slowly closer together. Suddenly an angry voice interrupted their romantic moment. "Victor!" shouted Kirana. Victor stood as she approached, not to follow the etiquette custom to rise when a lady approached, which was typical of the time in which they had found themselves, but more because he wanted an opportunity to run if she became hostile. "Victor, get back to the carriage and figure out what happened to Jonathan." His anxiety turned to concern, and he moved quickly toward Kirana. Seeing that she had his attention, Kirana doubled back and rushed to the carriage. Jennifer frowned as she watched Victor rush away, but hesitated only a moment before going after them herself. Victor found Jonathan unconscious on the floor of the carriage. He grabbed the Heaven's Breath key, and his eyes began glowing as he placed a hand on Jonathan's forehead. A moment later, his eyes ceased glowing and he turned back to Kirana. "Physically, he is fine," said Victor. "I mean, his breathing is a bit shallow, and his heart rate is slightly accelerated, but this is not abnormal for sleep. Maybe you should tell us what happened." "He went into the mind realm," said Kirana. "He was looking for Samuel Godwinson." "He told you nothing more?" asked Victor. Kirana's brow furrowed in anger. "Sure, he's told me plenty more," she shouted. "He's told me about how the mind realm is sometimes swarming with parasites or demon-worshipping psychopaths." Victor breathed slowly. "What do you want me to do?" asked Victor. "If you can't heal him with your key, then use Jonathan's key and go to the mind realm," said Kirana. "Get him out of there. Help him." "Kirana," said Jennifer, "he can't just use someone else's key." Jennifer had forgotten about the shocking news that he had used the time key to pull the group back to the time in which they had found themselves. Her expression turned to one of worry. "Even if he can," said Jennifer, "we have no idea what happened to Jonathan. All the more reason for someone who can to find out," shouted Kirana. Jennifer realized that if something had happened to Victor, she might campaign just as hard on his behalf. She looked away uncomfortably. Victor touched Jonathan's key and focused. Kirana's expression softened as Victor's eyes began glowing. He ignored the worry in Jennifer's eyes as the colors around him faded until only the blue tint of the mind realm remained. "Be careful," whispered Jennifer. Victor turned to her and noticed she was not looking directly at him anymore. It did not take long before he realized that he was able to hear her thoughts. "It's okay now, Jonathan," said Kirana in a surprisingly happy voice. "We've got help coming your way." Hearing her unusually cheerful thoughts disturbed Victor slightly. It was not that he thought Kirana was incapable of pleasant emotion, but he never thought he would witness it. He felt like a snoop. He decided to get away from the women as quickly as possible. As he walked, the scenery changed from being low, rolling hills to steeper and more forested terrain. He walked for what seemed like an hour, although he had no concept of time. There was no sun or stars to help guide him or indicate his direction either. Finally, he found a disheveled man on a hillside. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. "I hate it!" he screamed. "Hate what?" asked Victor, instinctively trying to calm the man down. "I hate it!" screamed the man, ignoring Victor completely. Victor shook his head and decided to keep going. After another hour, he found a woman screaming just as abnormally loud. "You can't run away from me!" she shrieked repeatedly. Victor rushed past the woman and tried to forget the discomfort he felt. "What have we here?" came a strange voice from a wooded area. A large floating snake slithered through the air out of the trees. Its eyes were surrounded with a dark aura that made Victor realize he was not reading the mind of some poor soul. This creature was real, and it saw him. "Stay back," warned Victor angrily. He hoped that he had masked the fear in his voice. This entire realm had put him on edge, and he had gained a new respect for Jonathan Knight. The slithering serpent either did not understand Victor's warning, or it disregarded it. The creature lunged toward Victor and opened its mouth, exposing rows of horrifying fangs. Victor leapt out of its path and rolled on the ground to get back up quickly. Victor looked around frantically, hoping to find something he could use to defend himself. He reached behind his back and pulled out one of his pistols, but to his horror, the trigger just made a quiet click as the firing pin struck the round. He attempted to fire 3 more shots, but it became clear the gun would not function in the mind realm. The creature slithered toward him and again bore its fangs. Victor slid out of the way, but as he turned back, he saw the serpent had picked up on his strategy and spun to the side. Fortunately, it had guessed his escape maneuver incorrectly, but Victor knew it was only a matter of time. There was a discomforting noise that occurred as the serpent closed its mouth, like the sound of knives going back into their sheaths temporarily. Victor looked for branches or stones that he could use to club it, but everything was stuck fast into the ground. He looked back and saw the serpent accelerate toward him. He lunged to the side, but the serpent darted down at him. Victor closed his eyes, and time seemed to slow down as the creature moved toward his arm. He looked up to see its monstrous mouth rushing toward him. Its savage fangs oozed with slimy fluid that shined as it reflected the ambient blue light. It had mangy, feathery scales on its body, and it struck Victor as looking more like a disease than an animal. No sooner had the thought entered his mind than he reached for the key about his neck. Heaven's breath was not really designed to be a weapon, except against injury, illness, and disease. His eyes glowed brightly as the creature's fangs reached Victor's arm. Instead of the pain he expected, there was only the feeling of pressure. Victor was thrown down against the ground, and the creature was thrown backward into the air, where it began writhing and shrieking as it disintegrated. Victor scrambled back up and watched it deteriorate into dust and blow away in the air, even though there was no breeze of which to speak. He slowly got to his feet and breathed a sigh of relief. The pleasant feeling vanished as he heard the sound of a familiar voice weeping. "Savannah!" cried the voice. Victor recognized the sound of Lincoln Thomas. While he rushed to see what was causing him pain, he would never have guessed how awful the horrors were that they had endured at the hands of the demon worshipper Catherine Page.